Good afternoon. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, joined by my colleague Cynthia Williams here at the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. So happy to have you with us for today's session. For those of you joining on the Zoom webinar, you probably know this, but if I don't tell you, somebody's going to forget. We can't see or hear you. We also cannot call on raised hands, but the chat feature is enabled, and we definitely have questions for the audience today, and we're receptive to the questions that you have for the presenters. Want to extend a special welcome to anybody joining on YouTube, but also make you aware that we're not able to moderate Q&A through YouTube today. So we have busy times coming up on Open Classroom. I just want to share with you what's coming up next week before we get started today. We have programming 4 days in a row. We are on Monday, that's November the 8th. We're having our second panel on the Brown School Strategic Plan, which is Driving Equity 2030. That webinar is specifically going to explore the Brown School's commitment to cutting edge science and to the St. Louis community. We'll be back on November the 9th, that's Tuesday, in partnership with the Africa Speaks program. Elizabeth Camus, who's a colleague to some of our Brown School faculty, Carolyn Lasorgal and Laura Iannotti, is going to be talking about child nutrition in the Kenyan context. And then on Wednesday, we're partnering with the International Center for Child Health and Development, a program called Advancing Scalability and Impacts of a Teacher Training Program for Promoting Child Mental Health in Ugandan Primary Schools. And then finally, Thursday, November the 11th, we have a program entitled The Beautiful Brutal Binary. It's part of our Artificial Intelligence in the Social Sciences series delivered by Linnea Brumbaugh of the McKelvey School of Engineering here at WashU. So many topics, wide-ranging topics, hopefully something for everyone. We would love to have you come back, and I will throw a link in the chat for our website if you'd like to register. But today's program we're going to talk about now, and this is several of the things that we love. So Rachel Delcou is a 2012 alum of our school. She's a native of St. Louis, currently serving as the Chief Community Impact Officer for Heart of Missouri United Way in Columbia, Missouri. Throughout her career, Rachel has focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity. She's committed to dismantling institutionalized barriers to health, well-being, education, and community mobility. And through Rachel, we got to know her colleague, Toya Stevens, who's the Marketing and Communications Director at Heart of Missouri United Way. Toya has an unabashed style to set the stage for meaningful dialogue to advance an anti-racist framework. And they've developed a framework to advance equity within organizations. We thought it was a great fit for our Advocacy and Allyship Series. So with the support of Rob Lee Foundation, we're developing a set of offerings that really seek to move past just admiring the complexities of pressing issues like marginalization and oppression, to challenge ourselves and our audience with ideas for what we can do differently. So here to share their work and their ideas in the hopes that it will give us each a bit of information to know better and then hopefully to do better. Please give a warm Open Classroom welcome to Rachel and Toya.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Janet. We are so happy to be here. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where and when you are watching this. For our live audience, we would love it if you would go ahead, if you haven't already, and share in the chat. Introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about the perspective that you bring to today's dialogue, your cultural lens, your professional lens, your personal role. And while you type, Toya and I will go ahead and introduce ourselves. I am Rachel Delcou. I often say that I have an inner Black child, although I do recognize that I walk around in the world with white privilege. Toya always likes me to provide a little bit more context for that statement. And the full context there is that I was raised in a children's home by Black social workers and surrounded by Black culture during my adolescence. I'm also a non-practicing Jew, a macro-practicing social worker. As Janet mentioned, I'm a Brown School alum, and I'm also a Jack Kirkland mentee. I'm a mental health and harm reduction advocate, and a few things that I rarely have to think of because they're my privileged positions. I'm heterosexual, able-bodied, cisgen, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hey everybody, I'm Toya Stevens, and I am an American descendant of slaves with Choctaw and Cherokee ancestry. I'm a single mother of 4 sons. I am an inclusive marketing and communications professional. I'm heterosexual. I also am a mental health advocate, and fun fact, I'm from Florida. Also, I don't have the privilege that Rachel has, not being concerned with my skin color.
Exactly. I think it's one of the things that's really going to be important is for us to recognize where our power and privilege is. And that is just essential to being able to move forward in this conversation. I see some other folks who have studied under Jack Kirkland in the audience, and others who are focused on race, equity, diversity, and inclusion in their work, as well as some organizational behavior PhD student. This is going to be exciting today. Thank you all for joining us.
So we do have a lot to get through in this brief time that we have together. So we're going to ask that our live audience be engaged and participate in the chat so we can be engaging facilitators and keep this as interesting and interactive as possible. So we'll encourage you to reflect deeply on how the material presented applies to your personal intersection of power and privilege. We firmly believe that each of us has power, and we aim to catalyze it.
We also aim to exemplify or model the inclusive, equity-minded practices that we've implemented in our personal and professional roles through our experience with United Way. Also, I see some United Way family in our audience. Thank you. Hi, thanks for joining us. Excited to see you here.
As through today's workshop, we will enable you to start to create your own equity framework that will provide you with a personalized roadmap for advancing equity.
1 hour is not nearly enough time to detail all of the aspects that we'd like to do for developing your own equity framework. And so we've provided additional research and tools, as well as a copy of this presentation and worksheets to go along with this presentation on a microsite. Janet, if you wouldn't mind sharing that in the chat, it would be fabulous for those who want to be able to download the materials and work with it during the session, or look at any of the referenced materials. During this session, we're also assuming that you have a certain level of familiarity with theories of change and models or frameworks. And while we typically use these to describe the influences of the environment on the person, today we will be using these frameworks to identify our personal influence in our environments. We like to set the stage for all meetings to be inclusive and productive, and so we like to start with community norms. This helps us set expectations and the behaviors and that we aim to model. We also aim to model these behaviors and expectations in all of our interpersonal interactions. And I would like at this time, before we go through our community norms, to go ahead and ask the audience to share in the chat any practices that they've seen that made them feel included. We are always learning from our audiences. And so share with us things that you've experienced that made you feel included, or practices that you've put in place that have made other people feel included. And that can be in a workplace setting, it can be in a classroom setting, it can be in a social setting. Just think of those things and please share those in the chat.
And while you guys are sharing, we'll go ahead and establish our community norms. So we ask you to be present and participate actively. We also ask you to extend grace.
Listen deeply and focus on opportunities for understanding. Challenge your own prejudices and stereotypes.
We also ask that if you make statements, or when you make statements in the chat, you make I statements, and be willing to be uncomfortable with some of the topics and the subject matter that we'll be discussing.
Be self-aware and non-judgmental. Don't judge yourself and don't judge others. Trust intent and take responsibility for impact. We often hear people say, oh, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. And that's okay. We trust that no one here is trying to do harm. We trust that everyone here has a similar vision for equity. And sometimes we know that our language or our behavior doesn't line up with that. And that's why when we take responsibility for our impact and change our behavior. And so if LaToya calls me out on something that I do, that's when I'll say, thank you, I'll do better.
Also, we're here to engage in dialogue, not debate. We do not have to agree about absolutely everything. And finally, we want you to expect and accept a lack of closure. It would be great if we could get all of this tied up in 1 hour, but we're not going to be able to do that.
One of the comments that is jumping out to me from the chat is one of my biggest weaknesses, which is letting people finish speaking completely. LaToya calls me out on it too. I'm continually practicing, and that is that genuinely listening. And I just get so excited sometimes that I stop listening, and it's a practice.
Absolutely.
So our vision for a more equitable future is what brings us here today. And it's not a new vision by any stretch of the imagination. But as we've worked through this vision kind of as a profession, if you will, we're continually learning ways to improve our approach and make a difference better and be more impactful.
United Way Worldwide, in collaboration with 24 local United Ways, including ours, and nearly 24 national nonprofits, developed this equity vision statement and the subsequent framework, which is linked in the microsite. We recognize that structural racism and other forms of oppression have contributed to persistent disparities, which United Way seeks to dismantle. Our United Way network strives to engage community members, especially those whose voices have traditionally been marginalized. We work with residents and public and private partners to co-create solutions that ensure everyone has the resources, support, opportunities, and networks they need to thrive. We commit to leveraging all of our assets, convening strategic investments, awareness building, and advocacy to create more equitable communities.
Today, as you think about developing your own equity framework, consider what your own vision for equity is in a more equitable future. What assets do you leverage, either personal or professional? How would you articulate the challenge that we have to overcome? What commitments do you make to advance your vision for equity?
Now, we know it's important to operate with a shared understanding of the issues and to common use of language. So we work from a glossary of terms that is found in the United Way Equity Framework, which is Appendix D when you get to it on the microsite. We also recognize that diversity is the result of inclusive communities and that building equity is the pathway to that.
As you consider the definitions of white supremacy culture, and racial privilege, I want you to reflect on how dominant culture shapes your sense of normalcy and language. And if you suffer from white guilt or white fragility, I urge you today to let down your defenses and consider through this session how your personal power and privilege can be leveraged to advance equity. Power is defined as the ability to define or change situations, and power can manifest as personal or collective self-determination. Power is the ability to influence others to believe or adopt similar value that those in power desire. Today, we're asking you to reflect on your power. In a workshop we did not too long ago, one of the participants reflected that the great lie that we have all been led to believe is that only the so-called powerful people have power. In fact, we all have power, and collectively, we have a lot of it. And so today, we want to think about how we as individuals and as a collective can change the inequitable systems and situations in society by using the influence we have wherever we find it.
Rachel and I had the privilege of viewing, as each of you do, Dr. Sean Joe's Open Classroom, Are We All Racist? Self-Oppression in the Language of Progressive Change, presented last January. We've taken this challenge to heart, and we've removed race for describing human differences everywhere that we can within our power, which is through our speech and in our writing. However, many within our network have not institutionally made the shift in the use of language.
Just to give you an example of some of the changes that we can't make as quickly as we would like, some include United Way's own equity framework, or in one of our local grant making programs, which is tied with our community county and city partners, which report to federal and state funding sources, which require race and ethnicity data be collected in ways that are inconsistent with our definition of what those words mean.
To do this work and build your own equity framework, we need to take equity-mindedness into all that we do. Otherwise, we can't be effective advocates or truly act with allyship. Equity-mindedness is the willingness and ability to call attention to patterns of inequitable outcomes, take personal and institutional responsibility for the success of program participants, for example, members, students, or other constituents, critically assess practices and demonstrate race consciousness, and understand the social and historical context of exclusionary practices in your field or area of work.
And if we think of a framework as an essential structure, right, that's underlying a system and something that guides the structure into something useful, then we can see how we can build a framework to address systemic and structural racism by understanding where we fit in and where our power lies.
The Groundwater Approach, Building a Practical Understanding of Structural Racism, is an article we share with all of our volunteers to build a shared foundation and understanding of the problems that we face. The Racial Equity Institute, which published this article and worked with United Ways to develop our equity framework, has a multitude of resources that are also linked in the microsite. We highly recommend reading the entire piece, which includes data to demonstrate the observations that racial inequity looks the same across systems. Socioeconomic difference does not explain the racial inequities, and inequities are caused by systems regardless of people's culture or behavior. By starting with this foundational understanding, we can begin to unlock transformative change.
Before we go much further, we would like to put our work in context, which actually begins well before either of us started working at our local United Way. We're located in Columbia, Missouri, which is a college town home to University of Missouri, or Mizzou. And the university is one of our largest employers, and it's also one of the most significant employee campaigns in support of our local United Way. When Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson in 2014, it spurred a lot of activity and protest and social unrest. And in Columbia, we experienced that as very high racial tensions on campus, with Black students facing racial slurs and other forms of open hostility. Leading protests for social justice on the campus of Mizzou was a student group, Concerned Student 1950. Their actions, the actions of the student group, are what initiated the path that we find ourselves on today. Their protest in 2015 engaged Mizzou's football team, and that's when they gained national media attention. They demanded the immediate resignation of the system president, Tim Wolf, who had refused to hear their concerns, the same concerns that Black students have had on campus since 1950. The Division I football team refused to participate in any football-related activities until he resigned. It's also worth noting that a hunger strike was also going on campus. Wolf did resign before their next game was scheduled, and they did play. Mizzou formed their Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity, and in 2016 hired Dr. Kevin McDonald to lead their IDE efforts.
Now, Rachel and I didn't start working for United Way until late 2017 and the very beginning of 2018, respectively. But by then, the business case had been made for advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. The national media coverage of student conflict with university leadership and the public relations nightmare caused by public relations professor Melissa Click when she called for some muscle to physically block student journalists during a protest resulted in serious financial ramifications for the university. In 1 year, they lost 50% of their 10-year enrollment gains. And the domino effect in the community affected student-driven housing markets and small businesses that were located near campus as well.
By the time Latoya and I started, our local United Way was also feeling the economic impact through our MU campaign, which also meant that we were perfectly poised to leverage everything that we were learning through our partnership with the Diversity Awareness Partnership, which then became in Columbia the Inclusive Impact Institute, or III, and also MU IDE. In fact, it's through this partnership that we were responsible for implementing the Inclusive Excellence Framework through the nonprofit sector, while III was responsible for implementing it in the business sector, and MUIDE was responsible for implementing it within the university system and other divisions of the state. This is the first time that the Inclusive Excellence Framework was delivered outside of a university setting, so quite experimental, but it has been applied to over 100 university settings, and there's a quite extensive research base on that particular framework. One article is linked on the Microsite. Us going through this process, though, provided us a new lens for carrying out our work, and we're always continually finding ways to improve our processes by using this lens for equity-mindedness. We're also able to contribute what we learned from this framework into the United Way Equity Framework.
So we don't have enough time to review all of the examples of how we've been able to operationalize this work on the slide, but it is also available in the resources.
Frameworks go by many names. You may be familiar with some called logic models or theories of change. And each of these have some common components. For our grant writers in the audience, this will likely be very, very familiar. And we could spend an entire semester going through each of these components. However, today we'll focus primarily on the highlighted cells, And just as we grounded this session with our vision and mission, you will need to consider your own personal and professional vision for equity as you develop your own framework for advancing equity.
Context and objectives are critical pieces of any framework. And today we've demonstrated the context of our work and given you some ideas of how to apply context to your own framework. Later, in the practice portion of the session, we'll provide some examples of objectives and encourage you to consider relevant activities for yourself. Frameworks often include a time frame and or a scope, although we don't have time to get into that really today. Inputs and outputs and outcomes. Again, we don't have time to dive into this, but suffice it to say, you'll need to consider what is the impact that you wish to have, what will you measure to know the impact that you're having, and what will it take to get you there. You'll also need to ask yourself, what will the change actually look like? You may have one or more purposes for creating a framework. In this context, we want to create a framework that conveys direction, shows multiple factors of influence, and identifies actions as well as interventions.
And what we really are hoping for is to create an actionable framework. And to do this, it needs to be robust yet flexible, and it needs to be easy to understand. While we will get to some examples today, making your framework actionable and putting it to use will come later. Considerations for putting your framework into use include orienting others to your framework, planning and implementation, communication and advocacy, and of course, evaluation, which takes us back to the idea that you should be able to measure outcomes and make sure that you are making the difference that you think you are making or that you're hoping to make. Again, there's a whole class on that.
The Inclusive Excellence Framework and the United Way Equity Framework are the two that we are most familiar with. There are 5 dimensions in the Inclusive Excellence Framework, which are as follows: access and success, institutional climate and intergroup relations, education and scholarship, institutional infrastructure, and community engagement. These dimensions represent internal and external focus in a variety of areas of academic influence that extend beyond human resources. Through an 8-month course, we learned the inner workings of this framework and adapted it for our business and for nonprofit sectors, and it was a great start.
We were able to then take what we learned and what was working and what wasn't, what was relevant and what wasn't, into the United Way Equity Advisory Council meetings. And that's where we collectively created the United Way Equity Framework, which has been tailored to the scope of United Way's work. And although this is captured as a lovely little graphic with 6 levers, and the Inclusive Excellence Framework is there with a nice little graphic, these graphics are only visual representations that represent pages and pages and pages of work. With the United Way Equity Framework, it's over a 200-page document, and it gets into measuring these outcomes in different areas, doing assessments for where an organization is currently at, and ideas for change. And so we would encourage you to dig into some of those things on the microsite to see what applies that we're not going to be talking about today.
The 6 equity levers in United Way's equity framework are data. Data is the lever that focuses on how United Ways can advance equity by effectively collecting, analyzing, and sharing data. This includes, but it's not limited to, using data to better understand community demographics, needs, disparities, donor characteristics, as well as how data can help create narratives that mobilize communities toward action. This also includes how we talk about what the data show, which is a failure of systems and not a failure of individuals disaffected by the system.
And I just want to jump in on Craig's comment about how important it is to use this disaggregated data, and it is categorized as race. And so taking into account Dr. Shanjo's webinar, how do we reconcile those two things? And I think that is a whole other discussion, but I think ultimately it's about recognizing that what we're calling race is not actually anything other than framing different groups of people through the lens of white supremacy. And what we're really talking about in those differences are cultural differences, ethnic differences, not difference in being human. And so the way that we collect data, the way that we talk about data, and the way we think the data we collect represents things about groups of people all need to be looked at with a critical eye. Oh, whoops, we were going through all these. Sorry, guys. Going down to the next lever, we have our lever for prioritizing equity in how we strengthen community engagement and mobilization strategies. And this has us looking at how we engage volunteers, including how we train volunteers and empower them to be ambassadors that can carry our vision out in the community.
The communications and awareness building lever focuses on how United Ways can leverage effective communications and messaging to help diverse community residents, partners, funders, and other key constituents develop a deeper understanding of equity issues. This also means that we reflect on how we use media in our communications to reflect Black culture and/or stereotypes. We're mindful to promote positive images of Black people.
In fundraising, resource allocation, and grant making, this can include everything from how we remove barriers to grant seekers, to where we spend money on things like office supplies or printed materials, to how we think about our grant making vehicles themselves and those processes. We also now evaluate grant proposals through an equity-minded lens.
When looking at local capacity building, that focuses on the role of local United Ways in creating a shared point of view regarding prioritizing equity in our work and working with partners to grow their capacity and skills to advance equity. Among other things, this level has us considering how we support organizations before they meet the standards of United Way certifications of accounting and board governance practices.
The policy and advocacy lever helps us focus on advancing equity through concerted policy and advocacy efforts, especially at the state and local levels. At our particular local United Way, we do not practice really what you may typically think of as policy or advocacy work, at least not yet. And this framework really gives us a guide for planning how we can be more active in this area.
If you want to adapt your personal equity framework for your professional sphere, we recommend that you consider dimensions of organizational behavior.
And we will not get into all of the different frameworks for understanding organizational behavior, but suffice it to say, there are quite a few. In business language, we might be thinking about organizational change management frameworks. Whatever you call it, they provide a structure for understanding the complexity, the relationship, and spheres of influence for activating change. And each of these sample frameworks that we're sharing show the complexity and multiple spheres of influence. Okay, Brown School family, give me some snaps or asterisks in the chat if you are familiar with the social ecological model. We are counting on the fact that you will be. This gives us a more personal framework for understanding a person's influence within their environment, although we typically use this model to consider how the environment influences the individual.
You may have noticed that we've been using the 4 E's model for behavior change throughout the session: enable, engage, exemplify, encourage, to catalyze. The frameworks we've just shared with you are limited and that they haven't been built out to be relevant to any specific issue. To do that, you have to spend a considerable amount of time brainstorming and adding relevant examples. But first, in order to effectively build your own personal equity framework, you need to sit and self-reflect on your own sphere of personal influence. When you consider your power matrix, where does your personal and professional power intersect with your individual power and your power as a member of a collective? Once you can identify your power, you can begin to consider how you can use it to remove barriers and build equity.
Latoya didn't tell you, but that was a real question for our audience. Thinking about your own power matrix, what would you add here? Please share it in the chat while we give you a few ideas that we came up with.
So the first one we have is interrupting microaggressions. When you look at the power matrix, you can see at the center of it is your voice, right? So that is your tool. And it lies in the center. It's individual. It also is in between professional and personal. Next
we
is
also have, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say advocacy. We can tag team. Sorry, Latoya. Is squarely a collective activity, and depending on where you are and what you do, it can also be professional and personal. In the professional sphere, it may look like advocating for pay equity, not for yourself, but for others that maybe do not fall into the privileged group that you fall into. So that's an example of professional advocacy. And then there's many ways that you might be involved in advocacy in your personal life and free time.
You'll see here the changing policies and procedures falls squarely-ish in the professional and collective quadrant of the power matrix. And that, of course, to change policies and procedures, it can technically be a one-person thing. I can make a decision to change a policy. However, for that to move into the realm of reality, it requires a collective. It requires buy-in from more than just me. And so that is why it is located on that end.
We also have community engagement. And for some people, that would be squarely in the personal category, but it is a collective activity typically. For many people who might be joining us today, community engagement might also be a professional activity. And so it could go in both or either sphere.
The next one is sharing power, and that is what we're looking at will be foundational to your personal equity framework. It is located in the professional and individual quadrant of the matrix, because for the purposes of this discussion, we're looking at what can happen, within an individual's their own life in an organization, and how can they identify their power and then share it, and recognize that in sharing your power, you don't actually lose it. Because it tends to be problematic when people think that they're losing their power.
I would also add that sometimes sharing power looks like a personal activity because it takes place in the halls of power that look like old smoke clubs or golf courses or places that are typically country clubs. That's the word I was looking for. Places that are exclusive. And so sometimes it might look like a personal activity, although really business is being done in those settings. And so it really is about sharing that professional power. My favorite.
Listen and learn authentically. As we just saw an example of Rachel getting super excited and jumping in. She has a tendency to do that. But the goal of this in the personal and the individual quadrant of Power Matrix is the only way for any change to really take place that is substantive is to learn to listen and to listen to learn. So it's something that requires you to make a choice to do it, and no one can listen for you, and I can't learn for you either. So that's why it's in the individual and in the personal space.
I lost it, LaToya, sorry. We're going to get shirts made and everything.
Yes. So I was going to get shirts for this, right? But I was kind of busy. And my quote on my shirt says, your personal growth is not my responsibility.
And then my shirt says, my personal growth is not your responsibility.
It's an individual thing, and everyone has to want it for themselves.
Okay, so now we want to get into the meat of this, into the practice of this, and start making a personal framework for equity. And we're going to say that it's partial because, as we covered, there's a lot of dimensions of a framework that we're not going to have time to get into today. If you want to get on the microsite and work through this and type up your own stuff in a PowerPoint slide that we have available as a worksheet for you, feel free to do that. We also would love it if you shared your ideas in the chat, because that, again, helps us as we go through this dialogue to keep it more engaging, and also gives us ideas for continued improving our own practice. And we are going to start with the social ecological model, because we thought it is what our audience would be most familiar with today. And we are going to be considering the individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and policy as areas where we can exert personal power. And so share in the chat as we go through each sphere of influence, ideas that you have for activities, and what you might see on your own.
All right. So at the individual level, you'll see several things, and we don't have time to go through all of them. So I'm going to pick my favorite out of this one. The first thing that any individual must do is that you have to make a commitment. And the commitment has to come out of theory and come into practice. So you have to make a choice and a decision to actively be an ally and to act with allyship.
At the interpersonal level, one of my favorites is our power to create safe and inclusive spaces in our individual interactions with other people through micro-inclusions. Micro-inclusions are symbolic actions that force us to recall the humanity of others, daily acts of inclusion, just treating people like another human being and seeing them is what it really comes down to.
At the organizational level, this is one of my personal favorites. It's resource use. So it's really being intentional about vendors, the types of investments you make, who you make contract agreements with, and things of that nature. As a marketing and communications professional, since we're talking about personal power and professional power, one area that I have control over is who I choose to do our printing for us. Who do I choose to purchase things from? That's not something I need to run by my boss. That's something that I made an intentional effort to seek out minority and women-owned businesses when I can and when it makes sense. And also recognizing that it's not always necessarily the best decision to make dollars and cents wise. Sometimes it costs more money to go that route. But in order to give them the opportunity and to give them, a chance at having access to something that they may not have access to otherwise, is a decision that I have no problem at all making.
At the community level, one of the things you can do is bring equity-mindedness to any collaborative planning process that you're part of, whether you're planning a community block party or maybe participating in a community planning process. Being a voice for equity is something that you can always be doing to advance equity in your interactions in the community. And depending on what your personal or professional matrix of power is, for LaToya and I, some of that power comes in being United Way employees. And so when we speak up for equity in any of the meetings that we're in that involve members in our community, when we speak up, people listen and they consider what it is that we're saying genuinely. And so it's very important for us to always be mindful of what we say and how we say it, so that we're not misleading people or perpetuating the very things that we're trying to fight against. Thank you again, Dr. Shanja.
Yes, and I absolutely agree, Cecily. Being strategic in networking will help you to have relationships so that you can diversify your vendors. And at a policy level, you can base your understanding of policies by learning from traditionally marginalized voices. So when you hear, well, that's the way the system works, you follow up, as Rachel and I do frequently, but does it actually work? And if it does, who is it actually working for? And if you see a gap or you see an inequity, then you actively look for ways to fill that gap. And because I am always the timekeeper, Rachel will let you know. And so Janet, you don't have to pull the plug on us. I'm aware we have 2 minutes and then we'll jump into the questions and answering period of this. But I do want to let you all know that the biggest thing that we wanted you to see is that, yes, there are different frameworks that we are all familiar with. But when you take it and you really look at where do I have power and what can I do, that we can all develop personal frameworks for equity and begin to make the changes within our spheres of influence. And your change, coupled with my change, and Rachel's, and Janet's, and Cynthia's, and Cecily's, and Meg, I'm looking at names as they pop in, we can make collective change. But it all starts with us as individuals. I'm going to scroll back up in the chat and see what your question is, Meg. Give me 1 second.
And for our audience who's joining us on YouTube, the materials that we keep referencing on the microsite are now available to you. You can use your phone to scan the QR code on the screen, and that will take you to the microsite. Also on the microsite, like I mentioned, the worksheets, there are the smart art graphics, which you can click on to start actually developing out your own frameworks and power matrix to begin understanding where your own power lies for mapping out how you can be a source of change.
Meg, I see your question. So how has this work impacted organizations that receive United Way funding? So at our local United Way, which I'm biased because I work there, so I'm just going to be honest. We don't have a single individual who has a DEI role. We recognize and we do see that it is everyone's responsibility within our organization to advance equity in their sphere of influence within the organization. So with the agencies, there's an expectation that they recognize our principles of community. And I'm not sure if they made it to the microsite, but if not, I will get them there when we're finished.
We've linked to our equity, inclusion, diversity page, so they are there.
You'll have to go down to the bottom of the site to learn more about what we're doing to see the principles of community. But we have an expectation that our agencies align with our equity vision. We help them figure out how they can operationalize that within their organization. We have been able to offer IDE grants specifically about assisting them with capacity building and advancing equity. And, sometimes that looks like board development or trainings and seminars that they attend. Rachel probably has better examples than the ones I'm listing off.
Oh, I'm like waiting with my favorite example.
Go ahead.
And this kind of links together some of the ways that we've operationalized the work and how it plays out. we mentioned that we do equity training with our volunteers, and our equity training with our community investment volunteers. Those are the volunteers who make decisions about the portfolio of investments we make in grant funded programs. We do a lot of equity training with them to help them understand what they're looking for from grant applicants, to see if they're aligned with the principles of community that LaToya was talking about. And of course, we recognize that it's visionary, right? These are aspirational goals that we have, and none of us are there yet. And so our volunteers are really looking for ways that organizations are showing that they are on the path of improving and investigating how they can remove barriers, center the voice of their clients, and do things of that nature. So I had an intern once upon a time, and during a site visit for the funding process that we were in, so we were with an applicant, an agency applicant, their old executive director, their new executive director, a couple of their board members, some staff, and a whole team of United Way volunteers. And one of our volunteers, the student intern, asked, how do you center the voices of the people you serve in your board leadership, in your staff leadership, and in your decision making? And the old executive director started an answer by saying, well, see, the problem with that is, and I can tell you no one heard anything that was said after the problem with that is. The new executive director heard the question, and it was just like a light bulb. Why don't we center the voices of the people we serve in all of our decision making? Why don't we? And it was a revolutionary question for him, which he took in to operating the organization. And so he was able to make some really transformational changes within the organization to better serve the population they were serving, because he went into it with a whole different perspective that the clients they serve have value and their voices are important. And helping isn't about helping somebody live up to my standard of white culture, but understanding what they want for their lives and how I can be supportive in getting them there.
I have a question that I'd like to pose to both of you. Thank you so much for your presentation thus far. I'm going way back up to the top to Aditi's question. Not a question, but a comment. She said she was developing a paper that the topic was on how individuals can partake in activism from inside orgs to address social change. Do you view your work as activism inside an organization and beyond?
Absolutely. I actually refer to myself, and I have a t-shirt that says disruptor. I feel like my job, my role is when I see inequities, when I see anything that essentially disenfranchises someone else, it's my job. I have a voice, and part of my job is to communicate and to speak. And so I speak out when I say it. Working with United Way gives us a platform. It gives me, as a Black woman, some professional privilege that I would not necessarily otherwise have, and I'm acutely aware of that. And so I take every opportunity that I have to do activism internally, because there's no other way to remove barriers and to, dismantle systems of oppression. I can't please and thank you my way into that.
Would you like to address it, Rachel, as well?
Yeah, I just second everything that LaToya said, right down to the having the power that comes with the privilege of working with United Way, as she's a complete disruptor, and she helps us all grow and improve for that. And I know that LaToya mentioned that we don't have an organizational structure that has a person in the position of IDE, or inclusion, diversity, and equity. Our organizational structure is one that has equity as underpinning our foundation, and ideally having all staff trained and taking an equity-minded lens to their work. But oftentimes that means LaToya and I are responsible for the training and for helping people see how the way things have always been done is not necessarily the way to continue doing them. And, you know, this also all takes shape or takes place in the context of moving away from colonial philanthropy. And so that is not something that happens overnight.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you both so much for this presentation and the wonderful resources that you've made available, so that what we're starting with folks today is the beginning of a conversation, not a one and done. For myself, one thing that I would love to ask you to comment on, you mentioned bringing equity to collaborations, and I'm super interested in hearing you expand on that. We, the four of us, all work in collaboration very frequently with other organizations. We also often work from a position of relative power due to, I mean, you guys are giving out money and we're Washington University. I'm curious, how do you operationalize that value of a collaboration through an equity lens?
You want me to start?
Do you want to start, LaToya, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can start. So I know for me, when we look at collaboration, there are many times when I'm like the Black person in the room. And I have zero problem bringing to people's attention that there is no other ethnicity represented in the room other than white. And there's nothing wrong with being white, but there's no way that there isn't talent of color that should have or could have been in those spaces. And so I think for me, I look at when we're in those spaces, I hold our partners as responsible as I hold my coworkers, as far as when we're talking about things. The same way I would say something to Rachel or send her a text in a meeting if she cuts somebody off, I will speak up in those collaborative spaces. And if a policy is not equitable, then I will say that. Of course, it matters how you say it, because you can't just be completely off-putting, but I think it's just really being willing to use your voice, which is the center of the power matrix, regardless of if it's toward an organization or an individual, making sure that when you do speak up, you have something to say and that it's relevant and it can be received in a way that leads toward progress. In this case, that would be advancing equity. So I'm all about providing opportunities. Rachel and I look at things differently, which is why I believe she and I work so well together. She is the futuristic one and I'm the context looking in the past one.
Makes for a very good pairing.
So related to your matrix on personal power, you asked the audience if they had a response to put it in the chat. Well, the response I would have put in the chat is, how do you think on the individual side, adding historical and elder or ancestral knowledge would benefit that personal power matrix?
It is incredibly important. I love history, so I'm about that life. I love to research and figure things out. And I learned a lot about myself and about my family, looking at, where we came from. And so, we were owned by a family of three brothers in Virginia in what is now Nottoway County. My maiden name is Folks. And so looking at history allows me to, one, recognize the sacrifices that were made. It makes it easier for me to speak up when I see things. I feel like there was a lot of equity that was put into my ability to sit here with you all today. And so I have a responsibility to know history, one, so that I can appreciate it, and two, so that some of that stuff doesn't continue to repeat itself as we move forward. And I think that having that historical perspective, it's paramount. And I don't know how you can really move forward acting like the past didn't happen.
Thank you. Let's see. Rachel, would you like to respond?
Yeah, for me, I would say that my own Jewish heritage and not so much the being Jewish part, but being the offspring of Holocaust survivors. Being in a position where my direct family has, suffered at the hands of oppression. I grew up with a lens of understanding, and then being in a children's home, I also, again, saw a stark contrast that gave me a lens of understanding that there are disparities and that the problems aren't with people, but that people are affected by these situations. And it really just, I think, is the foundation of my drive to be engaged in making a difference.
I see a question in the chat I want to try to answer real quick, Aditi. So unfortunately, a lot of that is outside of our control. So I think it takes one, knowing what your motives are when you're saying things, being willing to have the conversation regardless of how it is received, but making sure that you're aware that it just matters how you speak. Unfortunately, as a person of color, it matters more how I say some things than it matters how Rachel says some things. And so for me, it's being mindful of that. Do I like it? No. Sometimes I'm only heard when the Southern accent starts to take over. And I try not to do that. And Rachel's laughing because it happens every once in a while. But some things are off-putting to people because they are defensive and they are feeling attacked. If I know that my intention is not to attack you and I have not attacked you, then you're dismissing the content because you don't want to learn, and I can't force you to. So it's that balance between recognizing how am I interacting, how am I relating to others, and am I considering them when I'm communicating with them so that it could be a productive conversation, but also being okay with the fact that some people just don't want to hear it. And they won't hear it because it came from me, but they might hear it if it comes from Rachel. They may hear it if it comes from Janet. They may hear it if it comes from Cynthia. And not feeling like I have to be the one to fix all the problems in the world. We can have the conversation, and then if I upset you, it means that something I said stuck with you. So you'll think about it when I walk away, and I'm okay with that too. That's a win.
I just also want to recognize that LaToya helps me in my communication not be completely off-putting, because I tend to not have the filter, and she really helps me with that.
She gets to have no filter on Fridays.
That's not today.
No, it's Thursday.
We would be in trouble if this were scheduled on a Friday.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. This is an observation next to probably the last question, but it's an observation I'd like for you to entertain. I remember, we're using the term now, disruptor and compassionate disruptor. But I remember when individuals who are called disruptors today were in previous times called angry Black women, militant, dangerous, and sometimes isolated. I'd like for one or both of you to respond to the changes that have occurred over time, where the conversations that we have now were once set aside, but now in some respects are sought after. Can you respond to that?
Yes, I think some of it is really just recognizing that it's not necessarily a negative thing. Being a woman and having a voice is not a negative thing. Being a Black woman and being upset by, what have become cultural and societal norms that put my children at risk every day, it's not a bad thing. I have the right to be upset about some things. And you may not be upset about the same things that I'm upset about. But the issue becomes, how do I go about addressing those things? I can be angry and I can be productive. And so if you want to call me a disruptor, I'll take it. I actually put it on a t-shirt. I'm okay with it. I think in the past, it's something that we shied away from because we wanted it to be accepted. and we wanted to be viewed, and we wanted to make sure everyone would listen. I think now we recognize everyone's not going to listen, but my voice is loud enough to reach who it was designed to reach. And I'll speak to those people. And then the people that your voice was engineered to reach, you'll reach those people. But I will own disruption because it's the only way that we can get to progress.
And I would just add that,
same.
sorry, I would just add that, it also probably depends on your perspective. We're embracing the word disruptor and activist. But, if you were in a position where you wanted to be upholding white supremacy and white supremacy culture, then you might see LaToya as an angry Black woman. You might say disruptor and feel threatened, right? We're embracing those words because they represent the change and the vision that we see enacted today. But if you were not on this journey with us, those things might be threatening. But like LaToya said earlier, sharing your power doesn't mean losing your power.
Well, I want to reflect to you both a beautiful comment in the chat from Mel, who says, this was absolutely amazing, and I'm so grateful that I was able to hear both of you speak. I'm sharing all of these resources with my DEI committee as we speak. The committee needs to hear and see all of this. So here to that, I couldn't say it better. Before we close, because we are at time, I would just like to give both LaToya and Rachel an opportunity to leave us with a last word, whatever encouragement you want to offer to our audience going forward for what we might do next.
You can go first this time, Rachel.
I would say look at the microsite and start looking at the challenges there and the resources there, and thinking about how this applies to your personal and professional lives.
Yes, so Rachel mentioned there are some challenges that we laid out at the very beginning of the microsite. What I would encourage you to do, one, is just to lean into it. No one's going to be happy all the time. Once you settle within yourself that is the case, it makes making steps forward easier. And then just recognize this is work for the long term, and it starts with you. So that's all we are asking you to do, is look at what can I do and do the best that you can at what you can do, and we can do things together. But thank you so much for having us. This has been great.
Thank you so much.
Both. Thanks to our audience for all the resources and ideas they've shared. Cynthia, thank you so much for your able moderation. This has been a fantastic session, and I'm so grateful to have spent this time learning with and from you all. And with that, we're going to close another Open Classroom program. We wish everybody a wonderful day. Please stay healthy and safe out there, and we hope to see you again very soon. Take care. Goodbye now.
Thank you.